Welcome back to Tanya in 5. The last few days we've been studying chapter 24. In chapter 22 we established what idol worship is. Essentially, it's God indeed wants idol to exist, and God indeed invests energy into that existence, but the godliness is so concealed within it that it declares itself independent from God. In chapter 23, we explained what a mitzvah is. God desires all the world, all the cosmos, both physical and spiritual, but there's an ultimate purpose and the ultimate desire for which He wanted all of that, and that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah is the end goal, the ultimate desire of God for this in this entire project. And thus, when the person does a mitzvah, one is the embodiment and therefore one with God Himself as He is expressed in that ultimate desire. Now in chapter 24, the Alter Rebbe explains what a sin is. A sin essentially is the inverse of a mitzvah. Indeed, God wants the sin to exist, but the only purpose for God's desire for its existence is so that the Jews should say no to it. Now, if that's the case, then the moment the Jew does a sin, in that moment, the Jew is essentially declaring independence from God. God says, here's a sin, don't do it. And I say, well, I'm doing it anyway. It is the ultimate declaration of independence from the truth that God is the only truth. And in some way, in the moment that I do that sin, it's exactly like idol worship. If idol worship, as we described in chapter 24, is an existence which declares independence from God, then when I do a sin, I'm doing the same thing. God says, don't do it, and I say, well, I do what I want. That is a very strong statement of independence from God's oneness and from God's truth. Furthermore, in some way, the act of sin is even worse, because the existence of idol worship is living and being in exactly the way God designed it. God designed this item to be klippah so that it could conceal godliness, so that I can have free choice. So it's never breaking from its reason for existing. Whereas the Jew, who willfully and consciously chooses to do something that's in the opposition of what God asked them, is declaring more independence from God than even the notion of idol worship. The notion of idol worship indeed declares independence from God, but it declares independence from God because that's what God made it do. Whereas the Jew who chooses to sin, that's already by his own choice. And therefore this declaration the Jew is making of independence from God is in some way worse than idol worship. It's clear then at this point that doing sin is the most foolish of things on two accounts. Number one, were I to remember that deep in me there is an existential attachment to God, I would never willfully allow myself to do an act that detaches me from God, even momentarily. And secondly, the big mistake, the big foolish idea to think the sin is no big deal. Idol worship, that's terrible, and I would never do that. But this sin, it's not such a big deal. I'm still a good Jew. And there's the big mistake. That sin, in that moment, is a declaration of independence from God, and therefore, in that moment, in some way, is exactly like idol worship. And were we to remember that, we would never sin. The takeaway from all of this is two things. Number one, don't be a fool. Don't exchange your existential attachment to God for a couple of moments of physical pleasure. And number two, have some compassion on your godly soul. Throughout this entire time, while the Jew is engaged in the sin, the godly soul is still there. And it's a huge pity on it that it's got to be trapped in a body that's doing something that is so antithetical to what it is. It's like taking a part of God and dragging it right into the garbage. And we shouldn't do that. Looking forward to seeing you when we conclude chapter 25.